Hey everybody, Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach. We're second day of Shavuot, and I will be doing some teaching on, I believe I'm limiting myself to the first so-called Dibur, the first divine statement that we call the Ten Commandments in English and our Aseret HaDibrot in Hebrew. So I'm going to dive deep into a few words, and I want to share with you something that I've learned by studying with Professor Dan McClellan. I mentioned to you that I had an old TikTok feed which was full of jokes and magic tricks and martial arts and stretches. I said, okay, I'm done with that, past COVID. So I opened my new account, which is Rabbi Mordecai Finley. I've only made one post, but I'm going to start posting every week if you're interested. If you don't have TikTok, you can follow Dan McClellan and me, and your lives, I believe, are going to be pretty full. In any case, he is a fabulous Bible scholar, and one thing that he's focused on, which, as I mentioned last night, I knew this, but I never put it together. So I want to show you just a couple of things I've learned from watching many of his posts. They're too numerous to count, but I've been able to look at a few. Here's something you'll find interesting if you open up your Bibles, and that is two names of God in the first two verses. It says, Vayidaber Elohim, and Elohim spoke all of these devarim, all of these words or speech statements. And then as it were, Elohim is now, this is in the third person voice, a description voice, and now it's quoting the divine speaking to the people. So it says, Anochi Adonai Elohecha. So it goes from the third person, non-meaning descriptive voice, saying that Elohim said this, but when the divine speaks in the first person, the divine refers to the divine self as Adonai. So I just want to remind everybody, this is well-known territory for just about everybody, but in case we have some people who haven't examined this, whenever you see Lord in a translation, I consider it to be very unfortunate because it's translating a word that in Hebrew we say Adonai in order not to say what's in the printed text, which is Yud He Vav He, YHVH. Now, why don't we pronounce, this is for instructional purposes only, why don't we pronounce Yahweh? That's probably how it's pronounced, Yahweh. Not supposed to pronounce it. When you see Yud He Vav He, when you see Yahweh, you're supposed to say Adonai. Now, why don't we say Yahweh except for instructional purposes? Well, the main reason given is the so-called third of the Diburim, the third of the Ten Commandments, which is, it says, Lo tisa et shem Yud He Vav He et shem Yahweh or Adonai Elohecha Lashav. Now, laseit means to lift up, but it probably means something like to make use of. Now, this may have referred to magical spells. And as you know, one of the themes of the Bible is there is sorcery, there is witchcraft, there is magic. And as you know, in all societies, they would invoke a name of a god in polytheistic societies. So what we see here is a movement from polytheism to what is called henotheism, which means there is a supreme God, but there are other gods. And one thing that let's say the Yud He Vav He, the name Yud He Vav He is becoming the name of the supreme God. I'll more about that in just a second. So it says, don't use this in magical spells. Now, lashav, in vain meaning, as you'll see, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, it's understood to be vain, meaning lashav for no reason, which means if you try to invoke the name of the Yud He Vav He for magic, you're actually doing nothing. You are accomplishing nothing. The only time one can use the Yud He Vav He is if you want to prove something by an oath. Now, this is a strange thing for us to hear. In Talmudic times, there's evidence that if there was some dispute but no evidence, you could say, okay, here's the evidence. I am swearing by the name of God, case closed. That was evidence that whatever you said, whatever you saw, was absolutely true. So therefore, swearing falsely by the divine name in the Bible is a capital offense. You see this other times where people curse by the divine name. Remember the case of the blasphemer in Leviticus 24, and he was stoned by the community. That's just one of those lines one does not cross. So what does Yud He Vav He, Yahweh, actually mean? It seems to be from the Hebrew verb root He Vav or He Yud He, Haya, Hawa, or Hava, which is from the word to be. Lihiyot means to be in Hebrew. So Haya means was, Hoveh means the present, Yehiyah means shall be. But those of you who speak Hebrew notice that Yahweh is in the verb form of causative. For example, I would say Haner Dolek, the candle is lit, but I would say Madlik Ner or Lahadlik Ner, which means cause the candle to be lit. So whenever you hear the Ai Lehadlik, for example, Kotev is write, Lahaktiv is to dictate. Lavash means to wear, Lahalbish means to dress somebody else. So when you have the Ai, it's causative. So Yahweh, it's an S sound because the verb ends with a hey, means to cause something to come into being. To cause something to come into being. Now, I'm going to say something to you that when I first thought about it, I was very disturbed by it. But I realized if I think about it properly, it's disturbing from a traditional Jewish perspective, because we operate with in many ways, the prophet's understanding of monotheism, how the text is interpreted down through the rabbis. One thing I learned from studying Bible with a Bible scholar, and I studied with Bible scholars, but I'm so focused on how the Bible is understood by the tradition that to go back and see things that are right in front of me, it's very hard for me to assimilate this. So what I want to describe to you is what I'll be talking about is not God. I'm not talking about God. I'm talking about names used to refer to God, ideas about God and the gods in the Bible that by the time of the prophets, people did not believe. Okay? So look at the so-called second of the Diburim, the second of the Ten Commandments. It says, you shall, verse 3, I just read it, Lo yihiyeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai. You shall not put other gods before me. Now, the direct implication is there were other gods. There were other B'nai Elohim. Now, they're called B'nai Elohim, so if Elohim was a name for the supreme God, at least one of the names of the supreme God, there was a set of other gods, but Elohim came first. So they couldn't get rid of polytheism right away. Now, I'm not a polytheist. I don't believe there are God of thunder and the God of water and Baal and the male war god and Asherah, the fertility god in Babylonia. There's a whole host of gods. How do we know they were there? Because there are specific commandments not to worship them. And one reason Solomon got in so much trouble, and this is just going to startle you, Solomon built shrines to the polytheistic gods in Jerusalem. Now that's okay. You want some evidence for that, right? You're saying, Rabbi, say it ain't so. All right. So you don't have to go with me, but if you want to go over to the first book of Kings, so you put your a marker finger in the Ten Commandments, and you're going to go over to Kings with me. So we're going to go, it talks about the building of the first temple. And in 1 Kings chapter 5, And then the next several pages are the building of the temple. And in the next several pages, sorry, I don't have it right in front of me. Anyway, we don't. He builds a palace for the queen, Pharaoh's daughter, and if we look throughout the Book of Kings from chapter 10 on, you'll see that he built shrines to other gods. We'll put that aside for now. And so when Yahweh says, "Do not use the name Yahweh for inappropriate purposes," probably sorcery, magic, etc., or to make a false oath. And then it says in the second dibur, the second of the so-called commandments, is don't put other gods before me. So what was the name of the original high God? Okay, so if you again get out of your mind that Yahweh, as the supreme God, developed over time, what was the original name of the supreme God? Okay, so everybody think for a moment. It's pretty obvious. Okay, we're going to think about Genesis chapter 14, when Abraham is fighting the war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. Remember, he's on his way back from the battlefield, and Melchizedek, my God is righteous, comes from Shalem, probably a shrine area that preceded Jerusalem, and he comes to Abraham and says he is now, as it were, anointed, chosen by El Elyon, the great God. So if we look over in Genesis chapter 14, just for a moment, how is El Elyon described? Again, you don't have to go there. I'll read it straight out. In Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, Melchizedek, king of Shalem, brought out bread. He was a priest of God Most High. This is the end of Genesis chapter 18. He is a Vahu Kohen le'el Elyon. Melchizedek was a Kohen. Kohen doesn't just refer to the Jewish priestly group. It refers to any priest of God Most High before there even was Abraham. We're going to assume that Melchizedek was a Kohen of El Elyon before Abraham even arrived in the land of Canaan. So who is this El Elyon? And what does it mean to be a Kohen le'el Elyon? And his name is Melchizedek. Okay. Now, if you really think about it, it seems that El Elyon was the supreme deity, that people who believed in a supreme deity and other deities were under El Elyon. So what does it mean that Melchizedek came out to him? If you want to, I'll read it aloud. In Genesis chapter 19, he blessed him and said, Baruch Avram le'el Elyon. Blessed is Avram to El Elyon, God Most High. And then how is El Elyon referred to? Koneh Shamayim Va'aretz. Koneh Shamayim Va'aretz. Now, for I'll say beginner to intermediate students of Hebrew, and sometimes speakers of Hebrew, make a mistake and think that the Hebrew root kana, kuf nun he, always means to purchase or acquire. It's a homonym. Sometimes kana means purchase, acquire, and it's homonym, meaning a word that sounds the same and spelled the same, means create. They're not connected to each other. And I see people going through mental gymnastics trying to make the words sound the same. So light and light as weight and light as light, I don't think they're connected. Let's say the homonyms are red and red. They're not connected. So we have homonyms in English. There are homonyms in most languages, and there's homonyms in Hebrew. So when it says El Elyon is the creator of the heavens and the earth, now we think back to Genesis chapter 1. So who's the creator of heavens and the earth there? The name is Elohim. For biblical scholars, this is evident that throughout the ancient, what we'll call the Middle East, there was a name of the supreme God called El Elyon when so-called monotheism began to form, meaning one high God, El Elyon. Anything under that is junior. Abraham was initiated into let's say by the Cohen of El Elyon to dedicate his life to El Elyon. Now, the Hebrew Bible then wants Yud He Vav He to replace the word El Elyon. It's the same God. So sometimes says there were many gods. There's many names of God. That's a confusion biblical scholars make. People believed in different gods. People had different names for God. If I believe that just as there is one God now, there's never been more than one God. In my opinion, I could be wrong. So when people say this, I say, yes, there are depictions of polytheism in the Bible. I don't believe polytheism names something real. Okay, so one has to be very careful when one studies this. Now, did the ancient Israelites believe in many gods? Yes, that was the big problem in the book of Deuteronomy, that the people were idolatrous and polytheists, and throughout the prophets. So we have this evidence that Israelites still believed in the ancient polytheistic gods of Canaan, and it was a constant fight as monotheism developed, meaning the belief in one God, Yud He Vav He, Yahweh or Adonai, and that the other gods are not real. So look at the advancement from, let's say, the time of Solomon, where he was building palaces to the polytheistic gods, to the time of the literary prophets, including our prophet Ezekiel, Isaiah, and others. They said, you're worshiping wood. You're worshiping metal. They don't stand for anything. There's nothing in those idols. Those idols don't channel down anything from the heavens. Now we understand the second commandment better. Don't carve images because they're meaningless. Now, it used to be that idols channeled down the God, and people would craft idols. So some scholars say the Ten Commandments, the so-called Ten Commandments, have many, many chronological strata. Some of the strata is ancient. Some of it is, let's say, goes back to the time of, let's say, Solomon. And then others of it, for example, the second commandment, is actually a later strata. It's disturbing to think that what we call the Torah is built of different schools of thought from different regions, different interests, and over a several hundred-year period. It's all taken by the redactor. And by the way, I think this is miraculous. When people say, do I believe in the miracles in the Bible? No, but I believe the Bible is a miracle. That this variety of texts were preserved, even that's amazing. We don't have anything else written from that period except inscriptions. As far as I know, every text vanished. If it wasn't written in stone, we don't have it. The Bible, what we call the Bible, was meticulously copied. It arrived in Babylonia. I sometimes think of 20 cartloads of parchments. A group of the Sophrim of scribes sat in Babylonia and said, we're going to make one book out of this. So they took I won't name them all, but we have a sense of what these books are, redacted it into one text, left evidence that it's compiled from many texts, and sometime in the 400s BCE, they finished it with Ezra the scribe. So Ezra the scribe was not the final redactor. He was in what I call the Jeremiah school, who seems to have begun the idea of let's compile all this into one text. Of course, we have the destruction. So when people say, how'd the Bible come into me? I can tell you how it came into me. And the more I teach it, the more astonished I am, the more blown away that I am, that these anonymous people put in all this labor for a later generation. They had no idea that people would still be studying this text. So we are the recipients of the astonishing labor of a scribal community that labored on this over a couple of centuries. We don't have any names. We have a few names from the book of Jeremiah. We have Ezra the scribe. So when as I'm teaching this, again, because I teach the canon, meaning the Bible as it is and how it has operated in history. So I don't spend a lot of time where'd the Bible come from, the different texts. I spend more time on, now that we have the Bible, how do we read it, understand it, and how does it operate in our lives? So there's two very different ways to study the Bible. But I want you all to know that a Bible historian looks at this and sees a different story. I just wanted to bring you in on that. So my last word is, what if Yahweh means the cause of being? Now, this is something that is very troubling for me to say, but remember, I don't believe in two gods. I believe in one God, but the name of the God Most High changed among the Israelites. It changed among the Israelites. So as you know, if you look at Greek mythology, for example, the Timaeus, there is the God Most High in Greek philosophy that is virtually unnamed. But if you look in the Timaeus, there is the demiurge, that a positive demiurge, which means the God that brings the world into being, the creator God. So try to imagine this. There's El Elyon, who is the ultimate principle of creation, but there's one God down called Yahweh, which is the God that brings the world into being. Disturbing, right? So now we understand why the name Yahweh, the God who brought the world into being. Time goes on among the Israelites. There is a decision. Do we continue to use the term El Elyon for the supreme God of all the other gods, and eventually the only God? That could have been a choice. Or do we use this God, Yahweh? And there was a decision, and again, we can't pinpoint it, but there's evidence. There was a decision to use Yahweh, that the God who brings the world into being is the new name for El Elyon, and is understood to be the particular way that the Israelites refer to God. So Yahweh became, as it were, the God of Israel and the God of the entire world. It's a complex story, but I want you to have this information that as Israelite belief went from polytheism, many gods, henotheism, a supreme God, and many gods, the names of the gods changed, and you might say the God who had the job of bringing the world into being, as it were, right under El Elyon, took the name of El Elyon, and that became the God of Israel. So what's Elohim? Elohim was a competitor name of Yahweh. So when El Elyon disappeared, by the way, you still find El Elyon throughout Psalms and many places in the Bible. So there are many biblical references that retain El Elyon. So you'll still see that. Elohim became the name for El Elyon in northern land of Israel. Yahweh became the name of El Elyon in southern Israel. And that's one of the ways we can detect whether a textual tradition is from the north or from the south. As you know, northern Israel was destroyed by the Babylonians in 722 BCE, although their text remains with us. So now what we have is the southern tradition. Remember, the northern communities were destroyed. Their texts were transferred to the south and eventually put into the Bible among the scribes in Babylonia. So the question, what do we call the God of Israel? The question was moot. It's Yahweh, the God who brings the world into being. They didn't erase Elohim from their text, which I think was incredible, because they could have said, hey, that word's out. The name of God is the core of God, which the divine that brings the world into being. So I'm sure people said, yeah, but what about the creation story, which says Bereshit bara Elohim, when Elohim in the beginning of Elohim's creating the heavens and the earth? Should we just take that out? So I think it was an act of extraordinary respect to leave the northern name of God, Elohim, in the Bible, even though the southern name of the God of the universe, Yahweh, took precedence, and our text developed. So long story. I just want to see what it's like from a Bible scholar perspective to look at the first two lines of Exodus. There's and again, I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg here. There's a profound story of how God's name developed, how God was conceived, and that the name El Elyon, which referred to the supreme God, was replaced by the Yud He Vav He, which of course is, in our belief system, that is the actual name, identity, and core function of the divine, which is to bring the world into being, which is also understood to be the God of the Israelites, but also the God of the universe. So now we go back there, and we have the descriptive voice. Elohim said the following things, quote, I am Yud-He Vav-He. Now we can understand from a historical critical perspective why we have Elohim in the first verse and Yud-He Vav-He in the second verse. Next thing I want to say is, why do we say Adonai? Because of the third commandment, we don't want you using that word in a way that will actually cross the boundaries of Yud-He Vav-He. Yud-He Vav-He is a very particular divine and does not want the divine name misused. So they needed to create a word that you say when you see Yud-He Vav-He. What is the word? Adonai, which does not mean Lord. If you know Hebrew, the word Lord is Adon. If you want to say my Lord, it's Adoni. They had to use a rare formation of Adon, Lord, Adoni, my Lord, Adonai, which is almost impossible to use. I don't even know when you would use the term Adonai literally. It would only be, for example, if English lords spoke Hebrew and I had three lords in front of me, I would say Adonai, my lords. But I think they had to pick a word that referred to, again, the supreme God without using Yud-He Vav-He, but in such an unusual way that no one would think you're talking about one of these lesser gods or a local lord, but rather referring to Yahweh. So they chose the word Adonai. Now, here's the great misleading feature of most translations. When they say Yud-He Vav-He, they translate it as Lord. But that's not what Adonai even means literally. It means my lords. But they won't translate what it says because it might confuse the readers of the Bible. I think it was a terrible mistake. What they should have done is not even translate Adonai because it's a meaningless word in the context. It's the word you say instead of Yud-He Vav-He. So in my opinion, if I were to write a translation of the Bible, I would use the word Adonai. And Elohim spoke and said, I am Adonai, your God. I would just put the word Adonai into the English language, which biblical scholars are beginning to do. Okay, that's paragraph one of my thought. I've used up a lot of time, but it's such an unusual thing I wanted to share it with you today. And the second thing I want to talk about, as I mentioned last night, is how this commandment is used in the Bible. So I mentioned last night that I have, hold on, I've seen it used in many places in the Bible. Hold on just a second here. But I just want to mention a couple. Okay? So this idea of I am Adonai, your God, who took you out of Egypt, appears many times in the Bible as the writers of the Bible use this phrase to put an emphasis on a given law. So of course we have our verse here in Exodus 20:22. So in Leviticus, I'm going to go to Leviticus 19, the holiness code. Each of you is to respect your mother and father. You are to keep my Sabbaths. I am Adonai, your God. I am Yahweh Elohecha. I am Yahweh, your Elohim. Fascinating, isn't it? It's not just I am Yahweh, but I am Yahweh, your Elohim. I am Adonai, your God, using the Yud-He Vav-He and Elohim. This is in Leviticus 19:3. It doesn't mention Egypt here, but the phrase "I am Yahweh your Elohim" is used for the warrant for the holiness code. We're going to go on in Leviticus 19:31, if you want to jot it down. Leviticus 19:31. Do not turn to sorcerers. Do not turn to sorcerers, witchcraft, mediums of the dead. Do not seek them out, because you will be defiled by them. I am Adonai, your Elohim. This is in Leviticus 19:31. Leviticus 19:34. The ger who resides among you will be like the native born among you, and you shall love the sojourner, the ger, as you love yourself. So before it says love your Reah, your companion, one of your people as yourself. Now it says, love the stranger as yourself. Love the sojourner as yourself. And then it says, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am Adonai, your Elohim. Now that makes complete sense. Why do we love the stranger? Because we were strangers, and we don't want to treat strangers like the Egyptians treated us. They turned us into slaves. Just a couple of more. Hold on. I want to get to the verse I mentioned last night. Hold on just a second, please. Anyway, the verse I mentioned is also from Leviticus, where it says, you shall use equal weights and measures. I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I should be able to find that quite quickly, and I want to give you the verse. If anybody has it in front of you, you can go ahead and yell it out. Here, Leviticus 19:36. This is the last verse I'll bring up. Leviticus 19:36. I'm using an English translation, obviously. You shall have just and accurate balances, weight, a just measure of barley versus another measure of grain. I am Adonai, your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So I have 7 pages of citations of how the term either I am Adonai, your Elohim, or I am Adonai, your Elohim, who took you out of Egypt, to punctuate a series of laws. Now, this is the putting together from last night. That's why we see the first verse not as, that's not a commandment. It says behind the commandment, it shapes our consciousness. There are so many things, there are so many mitzvot, things we do and don't do, because Adonai Elohim took us out of Egypt. Now, the consensus is it creates a certain kind of consciousness. It creates a certain kind of consciousness. If I can just give you an image, when I'll specifically mention the American military, because I have a lot of trouble with the Soviet invasion of Germany. There was a Holocaust of German civilians that we don't like to talk about. Let's say, but when the U.S. military, when the army came into Germany and truly liberated Germany from the Nazis, liberated France from the Nazis, the Netherlands from the Nazis, Belgium from the Nazis, they liberated the concentration camps and so forth. The reverence people had for America, for American soldiers. They touched them. They cried whenever Americans arrived. You can see the newsreels. People broke down in tears because they thought nobody can break the German army. Nobody can break the Wehrmacht. And the American army suffered terribly in breaking the German army in North Africa and Italy, suffered in many battles appalling casualties. And what were they told? Nazism is evil. They said, well, they're not on our borders. That doesn't matter. The call to arms was to fight evil. You can look at the history of World War II. And oftentimes when U.S. soldiers would encounter Nazi atrocities of civilians, by the way, very early in the invasion of France, early in the invasion of Italy, there's great evidence of Nazi atrocities. Now, I want you to think about that. So let's say the spirit of the goodness of the United States as an agent of freedom became pristine. I know it's been an utterly complicated world since 1945, and that doesn't remain. But it remains in ceremonies over American soldiers in Europe. We're going to leave it there. And let's say time goes on, and your civilization is developing, and someone says, "No, I know this is almost impossible to consider, so it's just a metaphor, it's just an analogy." Those American soldiers didn't come here and die to liberate our country so we could cheat each other. Those American soldiers didn't die to liberate our country so we could become neo-Nazis. Just try to imagine if there was a phrase, we are free because people came from across the sea in order to defeat Nazism, and we have graveyards filled with American soldiers to tell us of that sacrifice. Now, again, the world is too complex for that to remain a thought. But I want you to think, if in the discourse of every country, and this is uniquely the Second World War, obviously, liberated by the Americans, is a kind of a consciousness. Somebody died for our freedom. What do we do now? Brother, sister, what do we do that someone died for our freedom? It shapes your consciousness in a certain way. Now, I happen to be a deep patriot of American goodness. I'm ashamed when America is not a force for goodness. When I think when we are a force for goodness, that is our true vocation. We have a vocation that we have to live up to. Remember, I'm a traditional patriot. So that's the analogy I want to give you. So try to imagine, we're in some kind of political discourse and someone says, America wasn't founded so we could discriminate against each other. America wasn't founded so we could oppress each other. America wasn't founded so that we have a permanent class of people in poverty. See, that is a rhetorical device. The founding vision was this. It's in the Constitution. It's in the Declaration. And therefore, here's what we should do. Here's what we should not do. Okay? So that's the best analogy that I can give you, that the founding vision still shapes our political discourse. Now, left, right, and center. So clearly there's no consensus of what it means. But notice how much the founding vision shapes our discourse. That's Exodus 21 and 2. It shapes Israelite identity. It shapes Israelite discourse. It's something that is constantly drummed in. And at the Passover Seder, what does it say? Everybody there? Every person shall consider him herself as being personally liberated from Egypt. Just as ideally, American consciousness is rooted in the founding vision. For all of our fault, that is our founding vision, and we should live up to the vision. Okay, so that's my attempt to have you understand why the first dibur is far more than a commandment. You might say it shapes everything after that. All right, so I've given you a little bit of historical critical theory on the Bible, which again I knew, but not like I know it now. I wanted to show you how a Bible scholar would read a couple of verses here. I wanted you to understand the ideal, the vision of the Yud He Vav He, and how profoundly that Egypt functions in our national consciousness as informing our national vision.